A locked iron belt in a dusty museum tells a lie. The truth hiding behind it. The everyday negotiations of desire, power, and sin in medieval Europe is far darker, far more human, and far more familiar than most of us expect. Tonight, we enter the hush of stone corridors and candlelit rooms. We'll explore medieval Europe's darkest sexual secrets, not to shock, but to understand. How ordinary people loved and lied. How clergy preached purity yet fumbled with it. How cities licensed brothels while courts punished unnatural acts. How kings hid affairs in maze-like palaces. And how myths, like chastity belts and the right of the Lord, still cloud what really happened. Along the way, we'll separate rumor from record, myth from court testimony, and we'll keep a gentle hand on the shoulder of the past, knowing that much of it is recorded by people with agendas and fears. You'll hear about clandestine marriages and bedding rituals, clerical concubinage and municipal brothels, coded poetry, and the crimes invented for enemies. We'll talk about the rituals of shame, the tenderness of letters, what was forbidden, what was simply ignored, and what was punished. And when the evidence wavers, you'll hear me say, some sources say, because the Middle Ages come to us filtered through the pens of confessors, secretaries, lovers, and judges. Ready? Take a slow breath. Let the incense of memory rise. We begin where sin was counted, and where silence kept the loudest secrets. Walk with me through a medieval city at dusk. Bells toll Compline as shutters close, and in narrow lanes the taverns leak lamplight and laughter. The church's voice is everywhere, on stone, on parchment, in the whispered calculations of conscience. But in the streets, desire has its own mathematics. What counted as sin? What did it cost? Who kept the ledger? The early medieval church sorted sexual life into clear hierarchies. At the top, marital intercourse for procreation. Then, a sliding scale of irregularities. There were acts considered gravely sinful. There were times of year when sex was forbidden, Lent, Advent, certain feast days, and there were countless rules that turned ordinary passions into a spiritual puzzle. Manuals known as penitentials, used by confessors from the early Middle Ages onward, cataloged sins with chilling specificity. They did not read like romance. They read like tax code. If you confessed, you might be assigned fasts, almsgiving, or pilgrimages. Penances had a price, not money, though some sources say late medieval indulgences blurred that line. But time, cold meals, and shame. The lists are meticulous, but their very existence gives a strange kind of permission. To record an act is to imagine it. To imagine it is to widen the world of possibility, even as you forbid it. The scribes knew, the confessors knew, the people knew. The word secret in the Middle Ages often meant unspoken, but visible at the edges. Everyone knew certain couples were not really married. Everyone knew a widow might share a bed with a boarder. Everyone knew that a prosperous man's servant could also be his mistress. Public women, licensed prostitutes, stood at the edge of moral discourse and municipal planning. The sin was acknowledged, managed, taxed in some places, and pushed just out of view of the cathedral. And marriages themselves were slippery. By the later 12th century, the church insisted that valid marriage required the consent of both parties. Spoken words, here now. No priest was strictly necessary. He was a witness. That meant elopements and secret marriages were possible, and sometimes defensible in court if the pair could prove they had made their vows. For the proud family whose daughter had run off with a mason or a minstrel, this was infuriating. For lovers, it was a loophole large enough to walk a lifetime through. Bedding rituals held a different kind of transparency. In noble houses especially, the ritual bedding of a couple could be semi-public, with witnesses escorting them to the bed, then leaving them alone. Curtains closed. Laughter faded. The expectation of consummation hung in the room, an embarrassing focus for the parents, a terrifying clock for the newlyweds. The proof? Sometimes the morning's linen became evidence. Sometimes silence did. Chivalry, noisy, mocking processions, patrolled boundaries of sexual conduct too. A spouse considered too old, too young, or unfit. A marriage considered scandalously mismatched. A suspicion of adultery. Any of these might bring pots and pans and songs of ridicule to your door. It was justice by noise, a medieval social media of gongs and gossip designed to nudge the guilty back into line. We picture the Middle Ages as stark. In truth, everything around sex and sin happened inside gray. There were codes and there were exceptions. There were rules and there were wink permissions so routine they barely felt like hypocrisy. The record shows obsession with regulating the flesh. It also shows the flesh had a mind and a memory of its own. And in the shadows of those rules stood other rules, the ones meant for men in robes. We need to go inside the cloister now, where silence was thickest and secrets were most carefully folded. Imagine the cloister at night. The stone is cold to the touch, and the frost makes the flagstone shine. The rule says silence. The rule says chastity. The rule says pray without ceasing. But the heart, as every monk and priest knew, is unruly. And the late medieval church wrestled publicly and painfully with the private lives of its clergy. From the 11th century onward, reform movements pushed hard. Priests should be celibate. Bishops should set an example. Monastic houses should be austere. This was not universally new. Monastic communities had long embraced chastity, but the enforcement of clerical celibacy outside the monastery sharpened. Priests who had wives or concubines were prodded, threatened, sometimes punished. Some obeyed, many resisted quietly. Concubinage, essentially cohabitation without marriage, was common, especially in rural parishes and small towns. The woman in the rectory might be called a housekeeper, and sometimes she executed the household's work scrupulously. The parish winked. They needed sacraments more than they needed a scandal. They could calculate which sins belonged in public and which were better handled among those who knew the faces involved. There were taxes levied on clerical concubinage in some places, which tells us not only that it existed, but that authorities chose revenue over eradication. When reformers roared against this hypocrisy, they did so with a fervor that sounds modern. If the shepherd misbehaves, what hope for the flock? The problem grew louder in cities. Urban parishes were close together. There were more eyes, more rumor, and more municipal regulation. Some sources say that in certain episcopal towns, authorities preferred to license brothels as a way to keep clerics from seducing honest women. It is, of course, a fantasy of control. Desire does not obey maps or municipal contracts. But the policy speaks to the logic of the time. If sin must happen, let it be managed, and let it not disturb the families who pay tithes. In Rome and Avignon, where popes lived in the 14th century, complaints about clerical morals were fused with complaints about money and power. Satirists sharpened their quills. The courtesan and the cleric became a stock pair in literature. The reality is complex. Some clerics lived exemplary lives even in corrupt settings. Some exploited their authority for intimacy or advantage. When we look for secrets, we find not so much salacious stories, but an everyday negotiation between vows and need, between rule and habit. It didn't take a scandal to make the air thick. It took only the distance between word and flesh. Monasteries, too, had their quiet storms. Rules separated men from women, walls from the world, and cloisters from cities. But even stone cannot entirely freeze a human body. Confessors left hints. Visitations, official inspections, sometimes recorded rumors and admonitions urging stricter enclosure. Some houses flourished in genuine holiness. Some, under pressure and scarcity, watched the edges fray. Yet there is another side to this story, one that rarely makes the dark secrets lists. Many priests heard confessions with tenderness. Many monks and nuns channeled desire into learning, music, and care for the sick. The medieval religious world did not simply repress, it transformed. And in moments of failure, we must remember how easily an enemy's whisper becomes someone's history. Accusations of sexual misconduct were, and are, powerful tools. They could destroy a career. They could topple a house. They could be true. They could be convenient lies. Even so, the municipal brothel stood as a civic compromise, and the rectory as a human household. The church preached a high ideal. Life happened on lower stairs. And beyond those stairs lay another theater of intimacy, the marriage bed and all the doors that opened and closed around it. Let's step into the households now, where vows were made and broken, where secrets traveled fastest along the same corridors as love. Picture a medieval wedding. Bells, blessings, neighbors, the fragrance of bread, the hush and flutter of silk. Marriage was a public contract and a private hope. It tied families, lands, and fortunes. It also tied two human bodies and two tempers, two fears, two ages, and held them in place. The church took marriage seriously, and the laity followed suit. In that seriousness lay a web of rituals and secrets. The ritual bedding of brides and grooms, especially among nobles, could be a carefully staged performance. Guests escorted the pair to the chamber with jokes and songs. Shoes might be thrown, coins might be clinked. It was a ceremony to close a knot and to ensure, symbolically, that the knot could be drawn tight by heirs. The couple were left alone amid cold sheets and heavy quilts, with the pressure of a dynasty at the foot of the bed. But most people married without all that pageantry. In villages and towns, a simple exchange of consent, words spoken to each other, could create a marriage recognized by the church. Priests recorded, families acknowledged, and life moved forward. That flexibility allowed love matches to occur, briefly visible, like a bird song in a market. It also allowed manipulations. A man might claim a woman was his wife because she had promised herself to him in private. She might counter that she had spoken under duress or mistook what was being asked. The courts, flooded with such cases, combed witness lists for signs of truth. Who heard the vow? Did the couple behave as man and wife afterwards? Did they share a table? A bed? Adultery happened. Here, the law and the street parted ways. In literature, the French fabliaux, for example, adultery becomes a place for wicked laughter, a tavern comedy of tricksters and cuckolds. In the courts, adultery could rupture property lines and custody of children, bring fines, beatings, public shaming. A woman caught in adultery might have her hair cut or be paraded in a ritual of humiliation, though practices varied widely by region and period. A man might be fined or, if powerful, simply warned. The same act did not carry the same weight for every person. Sex and power have never been separable. What about the so-called right of the Lord, the idea that a local lord had the right to deflower a peasant bride? Many historians consider this a myth, exaggerated from fines or taxes owed at marriage, called marchet in some English contexts. Those payments were economic, not intimate, and the right as a sexual privilege appears in sources as satire or later invention more than as court record. When you hear the story, remember, it's a gripping tale, and tales like to borrow scandal for gravity. Some sources say isolated abuses occurred, but systematic rights are not supported by solid evidence. Now, domestic life. In many households, servants were part of the family economy. A young man might sleep in a loft, a maid near the kitchen. Proximity is opportunity. Affairs between masters and servants, between servants themselves, and between spouses and neighbors do appear in the record, sometimes by chance, when a dispute brings everything to light. Often it ended in quiet, in a payment, or in nothing at all. Sometimes intimacy was made official. A widower might take in a concubine, a widow might take a boarder. In societies where life expectancy stuttered and fortunes rose and fell with harvests, strict romantic ideals bent in the wind. There were cruel unions and tender ones, arrangements that looked cold but held warmth, marriages that were tender but strangled by law. We can't leave the marriage bed without touching the bedding proof. In some places, proof of consummation mattered. Annulments might be sought on grounds of impotence or non-consummation. How did a court judge such a private claim? Carefully and awkwardly. Witnesses might testify about reputation. Physicians might be asked to examine. Friends might swear to what they had seen or heard through a wall. It is uncomfortable to imagine, and it was no less so then. The line between private sin and public scandal was often drawn with money and standing. A powerful man's affair became rumor. A poor woman's suspected infidelity became the neighborhood song. Even so, secret tenderness survives in letters. The romance of courtly love, noble men praising unattainable ladies, was often literary play, but lovers did write with genuine sorrow and heat. Not all secrecy is shame. Sometimes it is protection for something fragile and good. And still another level of secrecy lay outside the neat lines of marriage. Desire that walked sideways from the law's expectations. The medieval word for the problem, sodomy, floated across meanings. It is time to say what we can and what we cannot know about forbidden bonds. We turn now to friendships that were more than friendships, and to the laws that tried to erase them. The Middle Ages do not speak in our words. They didn't talk about sexual orientation the way we do, but they did sometimes talk about acts, about friendships, about close bonds that law and custom try to police or punish. The very word sodomy in medieval records is maddeningly vague. It could refer to a range of behaviors considered against nature, not all of which we would group together now. That ambiguity gave power to accusation. We know that men formed deep, sworn friendships, brotherhoods sealed with oaths and gifts that caused no scandal. We also know that close companionship has always been part of human survival. But in the legal records, when charges of sodomy appear, they're often linked to shame rituals, fines, exile, and in some places and periods, execution. The fear was real, so it was the desire to control. In some late medieval Italian cities, officials created offices to police such acts, gathering rumors, interrogating servants, tracking patterns of meeting places and times. This bureaucratization of morality tells us the problem, for authorities, was not a rare event but a regular part of urban life. In France and England, the picture is less bureaucratic but no less intense. Chronicles whisper accusations at enemies. If you want to ruin a man, call him unnatural. Some sources say that charges against military orders, like the Templars in the early 1300s, included allegations of forbidden acts among initiates. These charges came bundled with others, heresy, idolatry, and modern historians warn us to weigh them with care. Torture produces confessions, whether truth exists beneath them or not. Even so, the ease with which sexual shame was attached to political trials shows how tightly woven sex and power were, and how allegations about the bedroom could rewrite a battlefield. Individual cases emerge from the fog. In some German towns in the 15th century, Court records detail trials of women accused of having sexual relationships with other women, sometimes involving accusations of deception or fraud. Again, the facts as recorded are filtered through officials whose job was to condemn, not to understand. What remains clear is this: people formed bonds and found ways to be together. Authorities found ways to name and punish. Then there are the courts, where guardians of the law try to peek into private life and define it. The language is often sterile. But underneath, there are stories. Two men meeting at a bathhouse. Two women sharing a home for years. Youths lingering in narrow alleys after curfew. What happened in those rooms and alleys? Here we must be careful. The medieval record is choked and channeled by doctrine. It names acts with crude terms. It rarely records tenderness. We cannot conjure what the evidence denies us, but we can infer quietly that every law written to stop an intimacy acknowledges that the intimacy existed. And there are the poets. Troubadours and later writers sometimes hint, playfully, obliquely, at same-sex admiration. The tone matters. Condemnation, humor, admiration, mockery. Culture made room for jokes and jabs, but not for public acceptance. Does every jest hide a truth? No, but the jest reveals the idea is in the air. The dangers were real, yet so was human persistence. In a world where family and reputation were compulsory armor, many sought affection in forums small enough to protect. Households, workshops, guilds, monasteries, where the oath to love one's brothers could hold both sanctity and peril. When a man was denounced, the accusation often came from servant or a rival. When a woman was punished, she might be shamed publicly as if to caution every other woman awake at night. Punishments varied. Penalties were unevenly applied. But if you listen closely, you can hear what the record will not say plainly. That love and closeness often found a way, even where no permission was given. And still, there's another theater of secrecy, quieter, domestic, and full of private remedies and whispered cures. If there's a place where medieval secrecy becomes almost tender, it is in how people tried to steer their bodies toward or away from conception, toward or away from pain. Let's step into kitchens, gardens, and apothecaries. In medieval kitchens, on shelves beside cumin and vinegar and mint, there were other things. A sprig of herb inherited from a grandmother, a charm nodded by a midwife, a folded scrap of parchment with a line from a psalm. Every household had its apothecary of hope. The Church's doctrine of sex for procreation cast a long shadow, but the reality of family planning, miscarriage, and constant childbirth made people resourceful. Let's be plain, medieval people did try to control fertility. Withdrawal was known. Spacing children through abstinence during certain times or through attempts at herbal regulation was part of family survival. But our evidence is tricky. Medical texts, often adapted from ancient sources, mention herbal lore that some believed could influence conception or menstruation. We won't list recipes here. It's enough to say that knowledge circulated quietly, part prayer, part experiment, part wish. Some remedies were harmless, others dangerous. Many did nothing at all. Still, trying to tug the stars into alignment is very human. Abortions existed in the Middle Ages, though the moral and legal frameworks varied by period and region, and the terminology of the time. Debating when ensoulment occurred moved the line of gravity. Churchmen wrote opinions. Midwives kept counsel. Scholars argue over how often terminations happened. The sources, by nature, hide them. What's obvious is the need that underwrote the secrecy. Too many mouths for a narrow harvest, a pregnancy that threatened a fragile body, a lover who failed his promises. When theologians thundered, women's bodies went on counting the days they could bear and the days they could not. Bathhouses in cities were not just for soap. They were places to relax, to flirt, to exchange news, to be human in warm water. Not all were dens of vice. Some were strictly regulated. But the bathhouse carried an erotic aura that moralists found irresistible to condemning. This says more about fear of pleasure than it does about daily life. The bath was, above all, a communal respite. The church, for its part, calibrated sin around intention and occasion. A bath before a feast? Fine. A bath turning into a party? Dangerous. The line was always fuzzy, which made it a perfect place for secrets. Then saints. The border between sex and sanctity was porous in the medieval imagination. Couples prayed at shrines for children. Mothers promised cradles if a saint would intercede. Stories abound of barren couples visiting particular saints' tombs, then returning months later with an offering of gratitude. There are also miracle tales that dealt with troubled marriages, with jealous spouses, with violent men turned gentle. These stories place the messiest part of life under a holy shadow, asking for help where medicine and law failed. Relics, too, became part of the body story. Medieval people collected pieces of saints, bones, hair, even milk from the Virgin Mary, so some claimed. The sacred and the bodily interwove. A striking example, the so-called holy prepuce, a relic that some towns claim to possess. Modern historians are skeptical of such claims, to put it mildly, and the proliferation of purported holy foreskins is almost certainly a product of credulity and commerce. Yet the existence of these claims tells us that even the most intimate parts of flesh were pulled into the spiritual marketplace of the age. Faith and the body were not enemies. They were allies and disputants, constantly arguing over whose plan mattered most. Fasting and feasting also shaped erotic rhythm. The church calendar restrained intimacy during certain seasons. These ritual breaks were often observed and often negotiated. In long winters, especially during Lent, couples found ways to show tenderness without transgressing loudly. After Easter, celebrations filled the air, and so did weddings. Spring uncoiled the body and the fields at once. The rhythms of the year were rhythms of desire. In this world of household medicine, spiritual petition, and seasonal dance, secrets had a different flavor. They were not so much crimes as precautions, folded quietly into the logic of survival. And yet, around the edges of everything, myths grew. Later centuries would project fantasies backward. Iron belts, tyrant lords, and a populace too naive to know the difference. Let's clear the air now, and then return to the rooms where actual scandals unfolded, with kings, with orders, with the people who had the most to lose. We turn to myths, rumors, and trials. How the darkest stories were told, and who told them. Let's begin with the iron belt. The image is sticky. A jealous husband, a locked cage, a key concealed until he returns from war. It is one of the most enduring pictures of medieval sexual control. It is also, historians argue, mostly a myth. Objects displayed as chastity belts in museums often turn out to be later inventions, jokes, or misattributed devices crafted for curiosity cabinets in early modern or 19th century Europe. Textual references in the Middle Ages are satirical or metaphorical more often than literal. Does that mean no one ever tried to restrain a woman with a device? We cannot say that with absolute certainty. Humans are inventive in cruelty. But the widespread medieval practice of iron belts is not supported by solid evidence. Why does the myth persist? Because it flatters our sense of superiority and feeds our appetite for scandal. It also, ironically, hides the real ways control worked through law, family, money, and public shame. We've already touched the right of the Lord, the idea that a feudal superior could claim a peasant bride on her wedding night. This story surfaces in later retellings, satire, and anti-feudal propaganda. The strongest medieval evidence points not to a sexual privilege, but to fees associated with marriage. Payments to a lord when a serf's daughter married. Money, not a knight. Some sources say abuses occurred, as abuses occur in all systems of power, but the legal right is not a reliable medieval fact. Now, the Templars. In 1307, on a single October morning, King Philip IV of France had members of the order arrested. The charges ranged from heresy to idolatry to forbidden sexual acts among brothers. Under torture, confessions spilled. Some were candid later. Many did not get the chance. The trial unraveled a wealthy, autonomous order. It also served Philip's financial and political aims against a group that owed him little and sometimes opposed him. Modern historians often treat the sexual charges with skepticism, seeing them as part of a script to make the order seem monstrous. Did forbidden acts take place among some men living in close quarters for years? It is possible, as it is everywhere humans live. But the trial's sexual focus shines more light on the methods of power than on the private lives of the accused. The darkest secret here may be this: that sex was the sharpest blade in a state's arsenal against its enemies. Consider kings and courtiers. Royal marriages were political. Love was a luxury, sometimes a catastrophe. Affairs, however, happened tucked behind draperies and disguised as favors. Courts breathed rumor. A favored nobleman might be whispered about with a king who loved his company too much. A queen's friendship with a young courtier might turn to treason in the mouths of enemies. Some sources say that in England, a king's affection for a particular favorite created a crisis, so sharp it tore politics into factions. Chroniclers wrote with bias, often paid by one side or another, and sex became a way to translate envy into outrage. Where truth ends and slander begins is a question historians still debate case by case. There were other trials where the bed was central. The story of the philosopher Abelard and his gifted student Heloise in the 12th century glows painfully. A teacher and student crossed boundaries. A pregnancy followed. A secret marriage was made, and then violence. He was attacked and maimed by her outraged kin. They both turned to religious life afterwards, writing letters that still ache across the centuries. Their story shows the medieval world's capacity for tenderness and cruelty at once. It is also a reminder: the line between sin and crime was thin. Punishment did not always fit mercy. Public punishments for sexual crimes varied. Adulterers might be humiliated. Violators might be fined or worse. Sexual violence in war, sadly, present in all periods, was both weapon and wound. Its victims often left nameless in chronicles that cared more for princes than for peasants. Here, our script resists detail. What matters is how communities tried, often weakly, to restore lives shattered by acts they condemned but could not prevent. Literature watched all of this and laughed, cried, and warned. The Roman de la Rose, a long French poem begun in the 13th century, plays with desire and consent, sparking centuries of debate. Some lauded it as witty, others condemned it as corrosive. That medieval writers could argue sharply about erotic literature tells us that the dark was not silent. It was contested. The audience had taste, opinions, boundaries of its own. Bathing in faint light. A manuscript illuminator painted lovers meeting in a garden. On the next page, he depicted a monk clutching a book with both hands, eyes turned to heaven. The juxtaposition was not naivete. It was the medieval mind acknowledging two truths: that desire is part of being human, and that order, spiritual, social, is always trying to frame desire with law and parable. The gaps between frame and painting are where the secrets live. At the end of this long corridor of myths and trials, we find a simple lesson. The darkest secrets of medieval Europe are often just the most human ones, made more urgent by smaller rooms and sharper penalties. It is time to gather what we've learned and walk slowly back into the night air. We began with an iron belt that lied. What we found instead were real chains, vows made and broken, laws sharpened against rivals, families negotiating survival, clergy wrestling with celibacy, cities licensing the very sins they condemned. We found lovers whispering under rafters, clerks counting sins with ink-stained fingers, and kings turned vulnerable by rumors shaped like daggers. We found myths that made us feel distant and truths that made us feel close. Across the Middle Ages, sex was never just a private matter. It was theology, politics, medicine, and survival. But it was also tenderness. A hand held in a crowded market, a letter folded under a pillow, a prayer whispered not for heaven's ears but to steady one's own heart. The darkest secrets of medieval Europe are not only about scandal. They're about the struggle to be human inside systems that wanted the body to behave like a paragraph in a law book. If you want more quiet journeys like this, into the rooms history keeps shuttered, subscribe, leave a comment with a myth you've always wondered about, and share this with someone who loves the hush of old stories. Until next time, walk softly. The past is listening.